The international system is facing accelerated transitions as competition between the great powers intensifies. Join this important dialogue with the Kingston Consortium on International Security.
Panel 2 is going to be looking at technologies and advancing the human security agenda, moderated by Michael Lynch from the Strategic Studies Institute, U.S. Army War College. So Michael, over to you, my friend.
Thanks very much. And also thanks to Howard and Maureen and the CIDP for setting us up, and more importantly, for inviting me back. We are very lucky as the second panel, because I moderated the panel number 5 2 years ago, and it was really difficult to try to continue to assimilate all the great talk and discussion that went on before us into that panel. So it was changing by the minute. So we're lucky this time to be the second panel. We don't have as much to assimilate. In what some may see as the new American model, I am the least qualified member of this panel, therefore I am the leader. The role of technology in human security is a growing concern, and I think you've probably seen in the previous discussions some things that will come out in more detail here, and some of that technology includes the rise of drones and UASs and counter UASs and unmanned ground vehicles, unmanned subsurface vehicles, etc. Intelligence tools, hacking of various systems, that sort of thing. The 3 presenters today are going to examine some key issues of technology. How can it be used? How should it be used? We often have played with technology in the U.S. Army for quite a number of years, and we often ask what can be used, and we very rarely ask what should be used. There's offense, there's defense, and there's monitoring. Proliferation of technology you can think about drones, you can think about robots, but you should also think about cell phones and the internet, those sorts of things. And also non-lethal weapons. We don't often think too much about non-lethal weapons, but they certainly are on the growth. So that's what this panel is intended to discuss. And if we're doing this right, we'll probably have more questions when we finish the Q&A than we started with. But let me quickly just hit the highlights of my presenters, and then I'll be quiet, because you probably have heard all you need from an American middle-aged white male with an accent from the southern U.S. Our first presenter is Dr. Michael P.A. Murphy. He's the Buchanan Postdoc Fellow in Canadian Democracy here at Queen's. He is affiliated with CIDP and the Department of Political Studies. He's also a Digital Policy Hub Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, working on a project called Canada in a Quantum World. Dr. Murphy holds a PhD from the University of Ottawa, where his dissertation received the 2022 Joseph D. Connick Prize and was previously appointed as a Banting Postdoc Fellow at Queen's. And I apologize if I mispronounce any Canadian words. Canadian understood, American spoken. Next presenter is Zach Kallenborn. Zach is a Master's of Philosophy and PhD student in War Studies at King's College London, where he's studying global catastrophic risk, drone warfare, WMD, and apocalyptic terrorism. Try putting that into a thesis sentence, why don't you? He's also affiliated with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the CSIS, and the Schar School of Policy and Government, the National Institute of Deterrent Studies, and until just recently, the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, or START. He's also been featured on Netflix, so we have a star in our midst, on an episode called Unknown Killer Robots. The U.S. Army has designated him an official mad scientist, and he was a centerfold model in a Newsweek issue. I think it was Nerds of the Year, right? Is that the nerd suit issue? He did not bring any copies with him, but he'll be happy to sign any that you may have had. Previously spent 8 years in Homeland, National and Global Security Consulting with a wide variety of government agencies and interagency, defense and interagency units. Our final speaker is Dr. Walter Dorn, who's professor of defense studies at Canadian Forces College and the Royal Military College. He has been the academic coordinator for National Security Program at CFC and chaired the RMC Master of Defense Studies program and the chair of the Defense and Security of Department of Security and International Affairs. He holds a PhD in chemistry, so he is a legit scientist from the University of Toronto, where his doctoral research explored chemical sensing for arms control verification. He later assisted with notification, ratification, and implementation of the 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention. His current interests involve international and human security, oddly enough, especially peacekeeping and the UN, and he has wide field experience. Ladies and gentlemen, I present our panel, and we'll kick off with Mike. Go right ahead.
Thank you. Oh, this tech group is great. I was just going to say, could you load up the slide deck, but you're already on the ball. Thank you so much. Could I just grab that clicker, please? Thank you. Technology. So thank you all for being here at CASIS, and also to the organizers for the invitation here. I'm sharing a bit of my research project that has been taking place here at the CIDP, and then also through the Center for International Governance Innovations Digital Policy Hub Fellowship Program. First, I want to acknowledge my funders who keep the lights on. The Banting Postdoctoral Fellowship, the MyTax Initiative, and the Minds Program out of DND. As the disclaimer goes, this, what I say, is not necessarily their opinion, although, to be perfectly frank, I wish it were. The programs here have done a great job to further inquiry-based research in the social sciences in Canada. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity for them to bring me here to CASIS to speak to you today. So Roland Paris encouraged us to look back to history, and I'm glad that he offered an eloquent reason why, because now I don't have to. I can save a couple of minutes of my talk. And I want to start in 1972. Lester B. Pearson, former Canadian Prime Minister, at that point fairly recently, former Canadian Prime Minister, spoke eloquently about what we would now call human security and the importance of recognizing technology and international equality and access to technology as a key driver of, what we would consider freedom from want. The comment that I've selected here points to the human dimension of technology outside of direct impacts that technical or scientific developments would have on physical security threats, and instead encourage us to look at the world of technology as one that sets the groundwork for how humans interact with well-being. Pearson's remarks highlight the long-standing connection between the social aspects of technological developments and what we now call freedom from want in the human security framework. In the exact same year, in a very different crowd of people, Stuart Friedman and John Clauser experimentally proved the existence of quantum entanglement. So this ended up being the conclusion of a roughly 50-year debate within theoretical physics communities that originally saw Niels Bohr and Erwin Schrödinger debating Albert Einstein on the completeness of quantum mechanics as a theory. Ultimately, without entanglement, a lot of the quantum technologies that are now being touted as the perfect solution to NORAD modernization problems and things like that would be impossible. So when we're looking at milestones in the experimental proof of quantum mechanics that set the groundwork for technologies that have a direct impact, in the current period, it is the notion of entanglement that looms large in this. In fact, in 2022, this experiment, along with a couple of later replications were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for an outstanding contribution to the validity of quantum mechanics. In 1972, these comments, right, Pearson speaking about the potential for international equality, and this lab development where a postdoc found some time to run an experiment with a colleague. These were very separate things. But I think my pitch to you today is that we need to integrate these concerns of the cutting edge of the experimental innovation in technologies like quantum science and tech with the broader concerns around human security and the way that we look at well-being for humans individually and societally. We're in a very important period for the development of quantum science and technology, where we can see the end game. We can see the point where these technologies of sensing, computing, encryption, et cetera, will be ready for deployment, but we still have a bit of time. Depending on the technology, that could be 2 years, that could be 20 years, but we do have some time to set in safeguards to protect human security and consider the potential social impacts, so that we don't have another presentation at KCIS 2074 about how if we would have just listened to the canaries in the coal mine earlier, we could have recognized the impacts of technology. So I think when we look broadly at human security and technology, I think what comes to mind first is how new technologies can create new threats against humans. Or perhaps if you're more optimistic, how new technologies can help with the protection of civilians or optimization of different security promoting initiatives. And that's kind of where we're looking at. The technological development happens, and then after we explore the positive or negative impacts of those technological changes on human security. There's nothing wrong with this, but I think resigning ourselves to a reactive application of human security principles means that we will always be trying to catch up. And when you're looking at something that poses the potential for radical social disruption, like quantum science and technology, then exploring opportunities to have human security frameworks integrated earlier into the planning cycle and the strategic engagement is important. To this end, I'm echoing a panel from last year at KCIS and echoing a chapter that Claire Hutchison contributed to the CDA Press's volume, Evolving Human Security. I'm not sure if we have copies outside. I know there was someone has a copy here. Okay, fantastic. Yeah. And so what Hutchison argues there is that we need to look at technology as a cross-cutting topic, not only as something that human security and folks who care about the issue should be reacting to after those technological developments take place, but as something that is fundamentally analyzed from a policy and defense perspective with human security principles in mind from day one, proactively and not just reactively. So thinking of technology in general, but I would argue also specifically the class of quantum technologies in particular as cross-cutting topics that will have widespread impacts for humans and societies around the world. There are 2 buttons on this thing. I knew I was going to hit the wrong one at some point. So my own work focuses on Canada's place in navigating a quantum world. We are not the richest country in the world. I hope that that's not a surprise, but that means that we can't compete on dollar for dollar terms with more wealthy nations. But when you look at the guiding documents of Canada's quantum strategy, there are basically three legs or 3 documents, and each of them reinforce the 2 key advantages that Canada has. The first one being we have a very strong baseline for scientific research into quantum science and technology in Canada. This includes leading research institutions in quantum computing and sensing and algorithmic security protocols. But we also have a brand advantage. Canada is regarded as a good place to live and a good place to do work and a good place to be a scientist. And that is explicitly named in Canada's national quantum strategy as part of our advantage. We can't perhaps offer as much money to the research institutions, but we can be a good place to do that work, and that can draw in high quality personnel. Another thing I can probably name without explaining is the importance of recruitment and retention in key sectors. I'm sure a friend of mine for that is in the armed forces in this room, but that is also a concern with these kinds of in-demand, cutting-edge scientific research areas. And Canada's brand as being an ethical place is seen as key to the success of the quantum strategy. So the question for this presentation is, how does Canada's quantum strategy consider human security? We've got these three documents, one from 2021 laying out the foundation of DND-CAF engagement with quantum science and technology. The second from Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, published next year, laying out the broad kind of whole of government, whole of society approach to quantum science and technology development. And then finally, the implementation plan, which prioritizes a specific set of sensing and computing technologies for the short to medium term needs of the CAF. And unfortunately, one of the takeaways from reading these three documents is that we didn't listen to Pearson in 72. We recognize that there's an important edge that being a good society having a brand as a good society offers to Canada, but there's not much in here about the impact of radical social disruption on the people who live in Canada or the people who live outside of Canada. This has largely been framed as a technical problem for the nerds in the lab to worry about. And we have not learned the lesson of the past that proactive engagement with social impact analysis is crucial to ensuring a robust approach to human security throughout the research life cycle in scientific issues. So this slide presents the three mechanisms. I'm going to just touch on them quickly here, but I'm happy to get into more detail. This is so partially from a forthcoming book chapter, and partially from an article that I wrote with Claire Parsons, who's in the audience today. We suggest that there are these three big trends in Canada's quantum strategy arena. The first is an emphasis from the beginning, from literally the first paragraphs of these strategies, that says, hey, this is a really complex issue area. And the deleterious effect of that kind of complexity framing from the very beginning of a document is to say that maybe this is a sandbox that non-experts should stay away from. And it disincentivizes engagement from non-expert communities with these critical policy issues. A second one, when we look at how politicians have engaged or not engaged with issues of quantum science and technology, I think one of the mechanisms we see here is that there's a convenience, right? This is difficult subject matter to work through, and when the complexity of the situation is reinforced in all of the strategic documentation, there's little pressure for politicians to engage with it. Finally, an increase in the intensity of the threat framing, so how potentially dangerous quantum science and tech can be, ends up having a chilling effect on potential debate on political, social, ethical issues, because you feel like you have the sword of Damocles hanging, and you can't take too long to dither on matters of ethics. But ultimately, this creates a problem because the whole premise of quantum science and tech being an area that we should care about is that this will change everything, right? This is the next great technological disruption and will radically change the status quo for everyone in the world. And yet we're investing so little in understanding what the social impacts, what the societal level impacts will be, that we're missing an important part of the story. Do I have 1 minute or 5 minutes? Okay, perfect. So now I want to talk about quantum computing and hacking as potential issues. So the National Institute for Standards and Technology, or NIST in the United States, has recently released a report on how petrified we should all be of quantum computing and what it means for our data security and privacy. And many of the encryption protocols that are being used today will be basically useless by the end of the decade, or 2035 at the latest, given the potential for quantum computing to accelerate computation that will break through current encryption protocols. So there's very strong advice to switch to other quantum safe versions of data security, whether that's a post-quantum cryptography that can be run on classical computers, or quantum key distribution, which permits data security through quantum technologies that would distribute access keys, or simply unplugging the system. For anyone who has some really secret stuff that you don't want getting out, just unplugging from the internet and never allowing anyone the possibility of remote access could be a great way to go about that, as long as you can ensure that there's no other Wi-Fi connector getting into your system. So one of the key challenges with the rise of quantum computing and the way that nefarious actors may be able to leverage that technology to break into systems are obviously the fact that will expose national security plans, intelligence gathering operations, and all of those sorts of issues, or all those sorts of vulnerabilities. But it will also have a human cost, right? This is going to expose vulnerable data about individuals who may or may not be in visible places. And I think the reason that we need to start prioritizing that kind of frame on preparedness for quantum computing threats is that already today, everyone in this room is under that kind of risk because of handle strategies or harvest now, decrypt later strategies, where actors, most notably China, but other countries and private actors as well, are just scooping up data that they have no use for now, because they know that once their quantum computing systems are able to crack through that encryption protocol, they will have access to all of that data. So the threats to individuals and potentially exposed individuals and nations, it's not a matter of the future and when that technology comes, but it's a matter of today and even the last 10 years when we have been under threat from this particular strategy, even if we didn't know it. That's a national concern for Canada to integrate more meaningfully into its strategy, but it's also one that's international. And you can imagine that the cost of migrating entire encryption protocols across key government institutions, whole of government or whole of society, will be massive. I believe the United States is looking at $7 billion for key institutions to make the transition to post-quantum cryptography. These are sums of money that lower income countries just do not have available to them. And there has, as of yet, been one relatively small program by USAID that's looked at raising awareness around quantum risk audits to lower income countries. But this is something internationally, if we're looking for reducing vulnerabilities to individuals and other countries, that should be prioritized. that's the last scary thing that I have to say in this presentation. I want to make a positive case to end, right, for why we should be excited about the possibility of integrating human security frameworks into technology issue areas. The first is that there still is time to prepare for the vast majority of threats that can emerge in this space, and there still is time to prepare for use cases to be meaningfully integrated into human security promotion activities. And that time is valuable, but we need to use it. We need to prioritize engagement with these issues. Some folks in Canada's quantum community have said, if we want to hit a 2% target, let's just funnel all of that into quantum science and tech. We'll make people happy around the NATO table, and we'll also be able to be a world leader and accrue some of the benefits that come from that. But I don't think it's enough to just look at how can we be reactive to these threats and opportunities from quantum science and technology. I also think that we should directly embed the needs of humans into these policy conversations at the highest levels as we go through reviews of the National Quantum Strategy and other documents. And within the defense team, probably one of the natural ways to do that is to have direct bridging between folks who are working on particular quantum science and tech projects and folks working on human security. The last panel had a mention of a potential human security advisor, HUMAD. I'm not sure. Other folks in the room will be better at acronyms than I am, but maybe something like that is how we embed this principle of human security into each mission team within the quantum science and tech strategy. And finally, the reason why at least Canadians can be excited about this possibility is that any investment that we make into the promotion of human security through quantum technology will directly bolster our prospects for success. Because ultimately, we're never going to compete on dollar for dollar terms with, the United States, China, Russia, and so on. But if we reinforce that ethical brand and make it something that people believe in, then that will, at least provide the conditions for success. There, we can pick up Pearson's banner and run with it and recognize that this, is possible within the technology environment. I'll end it there. I think that's a broad enough note that we can talk about other technologies too.
So first of all, thank you to Queen's University for organizing this. It's been a great discussion so far, and thanks for including me on this. So I'm going to start with, in 2021, I believe it was, the United Nations released a report documenting extensively the activities of what was going on in the Libya conflict. And there was a particularly interesting note that was in there that mentioned that a Turkish-made Kargu-2 hunted down and attacked retreating forces from, I can't remember which side it was, but the implication was that this was in fact a system, awesome, thank you, that was operating autonomously and was selecting engaging targets. And according to STM Defense, the manufacturer's website said this drone is actually capable of that. That said, there ended up being a whole political hullabaloo, and the event got international attention, and they subsequently said, no, we didn't actually do that. But the Turkish government acknowledged, yeah, we didn't, but we could. The point being is that these are autonomous systems, what one might term a killer robot that is using artificial intelligence to potentially select and engage targets without human control. So that reality is here now, and it's here to stay. And that's what we'll be talking about today, and what that larger trends in drone warfare means for human security. So the overall our argument is fairly simple. The use of drones is generally just rapidly expanding. It's becoming an enduring part of state and non-state violence, and we should expect that proliferation to continue across many different areas. And there are four larger trends that are defining the future of drone warfare, and it's going to interact with human security in a variety of ways. Those are more artificial intelligence, more autonomy, drones operating more domains, and just more of them operating all together. And as the drones become proliferated and become a key part of military conflict, that raises so much larger social, ethical, and international security questions that we need to grapple with. So to give a quick outline, so I'm going to start with a general, very quick overview of drone history, of how this has evolved, look at where we're going now, hitting on some of those trends, hit some of the issues with sort of the offense-defense dynamics that are really going to define what drones mean for actual conflict in reality. Look at some of those ethical and social challenges and look at, okay, where do we go from here? So give a very quick history of the entire last 100 years of drone warfare. So drone warfare, as much as it's gotten huge amounts of attention now with Ukraine and Russia and cases in Armenia and Azerbaijan, it's actually been relatively old. Some of the first developments were back in 1898 when Nikola Tesla developed an original sort of like a drone boat, and he proposed it to the U.S. Navy as like, this is going to solve all conflicts and do that sort of thing. And the U.S. Navy admirals looked at it and said, okay, this is a nice idea, but it doesn't really work in the lab. So thanks, but no thanks. It's not really going to work. Of course, we find out 100 years later that actually some of these technologies do work very well and has some fairly significant impact. We didn't see actual drones really being used in conflict until 1917 with the Kettering bug. That's the one that you see at the top right there. Now, arguably, this is more of a cruise missile because it was basically just following some simple various altimeters and whatnot to follow its trajectory and whatnot. There wasn't actually a remote control there, but it did have that same typical aircraft airframe there that is more characteristics of unmanned systems versus cruise missiles. We also saw some major use in the Yom Kippur War between Israel and I believe it was Egypt and Syria. Now, it was less major in the sense of like it was just overwhelming, but notably, Israel was using these drones to basically activate Syrian Egyptian air defenses so that they would trigger the radar so that they could recognize, oh, that's where the air defenses are, and you follow up with anti-radiation missiles to destroy them. And then, you've now popped the defensive bubble, and then you can follow up with manned aircraft and take a much higher degree of risk. Over the past 30 years, we've also increasingly seen terrorist actors and non-state actors start to incorporate and use drones. Shinrikiya, the Japanese terror cult, started experimenting with drones. I can't remember exactly the years, 1993 or 1984, but looking at using drones to deliver chemical and biological weapons. Of course, they ultimately settled on their subway attack, deciding that was a little bit easier. Drones really became into the sort of public attention really when it came to the war on terror, where the MQ-9 Predator and other types of systems became sort of the quintessential symbol of that war. And it made sense in that context where, if you're trying to kill a bunch of terrorists in the mountains of Afghanistan, sending a bunch of special operations forces into this really dangerous, unknown territory takes considerable risk. Whereas, you can fly that drone up above, you can sit and wait for the perfect opportunity and then carry out a strike. Of course, that sort of huge dependence and focus also created larger sort of humanitarian and ethical concerns about what does this mean for warfare, with concerns about, what are the civilian casualties that come with it. The drone also became a symbol in areas like Pakistan, Afghanistan, of sort of the overwhelming power of the U.S. that we can sort of just inflict this damage without being seen, without being heard, and it just shows up out of nowhere. And now, people and kids sometimes are dead. What's more, it also created some larger concerns about sort of the connection and relationship to warfare of these pilots, where they're seeing, as they're so far distant and they're concerned about what that means. But it's not just sort of terror groups, not just states. We've even seen organized criminal organizations in Latin America since at least 2018 start using these relatively simple drones to drop bombs. They've also used it to smuggle drugs over the border. They've also used a number of drone boats as basically narco submarines, where they would use those to transport large amounts of cocaine and other things across the border into the United States. But it really came to huge amounts of attention, both the Nagorno-Karabakh war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and as well as the current Ukraine-Russia war, where drones have had significant impact on the actual outcomes of those conflicts, or how those conflicts have proceeded. In the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict, for example, the Azeri drones caused massive amounts of damage to all sorts of Armenian systems and contributed to a very quick Armenian surrender. Now, in part of that, it's because Armenia lacked much significant air defense capability and were not really prepared to deal with this problem. In the Ukraine-Russia context, although initially Ukraine used very similar, in fact, the same system, the Bayraktar TB2, which you see at the bottom right over there. And initially, Ukraine had significant success with that, taking on a number of command and control systems, logistics systems, other types of things. Russian air defense has adapted, and so it ended up now it's much less significant than it was in the very beginning. Instead, Ukraine has been relying on much smaller first-person view, simple drones to find and destroy tanks, infantry, all sorts of things. Now, the point of bringing up this history is what you can see is this significant evolution of drones and their availability and their use in conflict throughout all of this time. And that's due to a couple overarching larger trends. So first of all, the growth in general computing. That is, when you come to some of these very simple drones, at least originally, there's a lot of technology that goes into you have to adjust the various propellers and the various engines and stuff to get exactly what you want if you want to, send the drone in some particular direction. With more advanced computing, development of flight controllers, you can have, other types of systems and computing system that does that relatively automatically, so you don't necessarily need it. What's more, you have the growth of wireless communications, where we can have connections to videos to see what's going on and operate them more effectively. And all of that has resulted in much greater simplification and availability of this technology, where now we can go down the street and go get a DJI Mavic for about $1,000. And if we have the capabilities, we can modify it, strap a bomb to it, and go kill a bunch of people. Point being, this technology is spreading, and it's spreading rapidly. What's more importantly for this discussion is it's also growing significantly. So you have increasing interest of integrating artificial intelligence into these systems as a way to enhance their thinking and capability. Now, artificial intelligence is, of course, a very broad spectrum of technology. We can probably have an entire panel focusing on the issue of AI. But very briefly, in the context of drones, AI has been of considerable interest for a number of reasons. So first of all, there's the potential for object detection. That appears to be the case in the Cargo 2 system, where you send your drone out and it looks for and searches for, is that a tank? Is that an armored personnel carrier? Is that an adversary infantry? I should, detect it. And then I can either relay that information back to some larger command, or I can take other sort of action. And the idea being there that you can potentially recognize targets that may have very subtle indicators, or that your a soldier might potentially miss. What's more, there's also interest in AI for a number of navigational purposes. Ukraine has been very interested in AI for terrain mapping purposes, recognizing that Russia has been actively trying to jam the navigational systems of many of these drones. So if instead of having that, what if you had an AI that's, say, processing the data through your cameras, and it can figure out, I'm over here, I'm over there, I need to adjust this way to hit my targets. So there's considerable interest in that. What's more, there's also considerable interest in autonomy. And by autonomy here, what I really mean is just the capacity of the drone to do things without human control. And that doesn't necessarily mean anything all that fancy at all. The simple explanation I like is, if you imagine that I have a drone sitting in front of me right now, and I have a big red button that just says go, and I press that button, and the drone comes 6 inches off the table, I suppose, hovers for 2 seconds, and then goes back down. Technically speaking, it's a fully autonomous system in that it did every single thing that it's designed to do without my human control. I wasn't ordering it to go up. I wasn't ordering it to do anything else. That said, in pretty much every case, that simple activity is utterly useless. It adds basically nothing. The point being is that autonomy doesn't necessarily mean we're talking about a Terminator with this advanced mind that can do all sorts of things. All it just means that it can do things without human control. And there's considerable interest in that, because if we look at what's going on in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, a significant proportion of both Russian and Ukrainian drones are being defeated by electronic warfare jamming, or by radio frequency jamming. That is, the drones rely on a communication signal between the drone and the operator. So if you can jam that, then you can effectively neutralize a lot of the actual threat. But if your drone is autonomous, it's able to make a decision on its own about go over here, target that type of thing. That jamming becomes much less significant. And I should note, we already have autonomy, and we've had that for quite a long time. Even commercial drones now are equipped with basic GPS navigation, where they fly from point A to point B to point C across a GPS waypoint. That's a relatively simple technology, and it's relatively available. What's more, we can also expect to see drones operating more domains. As we saw, in 1898, Nikola Tesla was thinking about drone boats. We have that. We see this Ukrainian-made system, I believe, with some support from UK and some others. That they've basically, it's more or less a modified jet ski, with they've strapped bombs to it, and then they would send a bunch of these at various Russian ships. And we're able to create some very significant harm in doing so, even though these are relatively small. I believe it sunk a number of Russian ships, as well as forced them out from the Black Sea and into port, and increased a number of protections around that port specifically. And again, I think these cost like $30,000, something like that. And that's especially notable because, in the naval side of the Ukraine conflict, Ukraine kind of surrendered pretty much early in the conflict, where they sunk their own flagship. So, we're not going to really contest the naval space. But now, using these relatively cheap things, they're able to do so. Of course, Russia has modified, and now that it's been less significant than they were when they were first introduced. But nonetheless, Ukraine was able to create some fairly significant harm at low cost using some of these simple drone boats. We also have increasing use of unmanned ground vehicles. At the bottom, that's a General Dynamics S-MET, I believe it is. It's a multi-purpose like equipment transporter. It can carry various weapon systems. It's also designed for, I think, carrying logistics purposes. Also can do various, I think, seaborne detection. Although I don't think this system is designed for it, there's also been considerable interest in unmanned ground vehicles for casualty evacuation. Because if you think about after someone gets harmed, you potentially not only remove one soldier, you potentially remove several, because your fellow soldiers are going to have to take the time to help your guy out, to get him back to base, get him the medical care that he needs or she needs. But if you can load them up on an unmanned ground vehicle and just send them on its way, it potentially reduces some of that burden from those injuries there. What's more, we can also expect to see more drones. We've seen in the Russia-Ukraine conflict where Russia has been increasingly used, 10s, 20s, 70, even I think in a couple cases up to 100 or so drones being used at once, all to carry out mass attacks. And that's not just drones operating individually. Increasingly, we're seeing the use of true drone swarms. That is, drones that are integrated and communicating with one another, sharing information to accomplish a shared objective. I think it was May of 2021, Israel became the first state to actually use that technology in combat, where they sent out a Legion X system of dozens of drones that were searching all throughout for, I think it was in Gaza, for various Hamas figures, and then relaying information back to the IDF, who would then initiate and say, all right, go blow that up. We'll send soldiers over there, that type of thing. And what's more, we can expect that to potentially scale significantly. India, a few years ago, for example, at their Army Day Parade, showed off a swarm of 1,000 drones that they claimed was fully autonomous, making selection and target engagement, go here, go destroy that. And whether that was, propaganda or real is less clear, but nonetheless, you see that scaling significantly. But of course, the effects are really going to depend on sort of the larger offense-defense dynamics. That is, drones are like every technology. There are ways to defeat them in many ways, from using various air defenses systems to jammers to, as you see at the bottom there, the Purius high-powered microwave system, which is meant to basically put out a bunch of I guess the name explains it, high-powered microwave energy to destroy a bunch of things. And ideally, you can hit a whole bunch of those. Of course, the complexity there is not everyone is going to have these technologies. In the context of, as I said, in the context of Armenia, Azerbaijan, part of why Azerbaijan was so successful is because Armenia didn't have a very significant air defense force. But in contrast, Russia did. But also, other countries might not necessarily have a sophisticated air defense. Certainly, civilians aren't going to have that. Law enforcement might not have that. Homeland Security might have that. So even if we figure out ways to defeat some of these drones on the battlefield, there may be vulnerabilities on the full spectrum of society. And those vulnerabilities are going to evolve and change. As we have increasing autonomy, as I said, part of the advantage of that is that you reduce the dependence on jammers. Like that at the top, you see a fellow holding a drone gun. That's been typically the choice for law enforcement and Homeland Security, to use something like that just jams that signal. But if you have an autonomous drone that can operate without human control, then all of that focus on all those little handheld jammers isn't going to work so well. So now you're going to need to instead focus on various kinetic solutions, or get those high-powered microwaves, or put a high-powered laser in Ottawa or wherever, whether that works, and the costs that come with it is a larger issue. But the point is, there's going to be this complex vulnerability that's going to affect harm both today and in tomorrow, as both of these technologies change and evolve in response to one another. What's more, this raises some larger ethical and social challenges. One of the biggest ones are whether robots should be allowed to kill. As I said, the Cargo 2 incident was the first time that we had a truly autonomous robot being used in combat, at least potentially. But there's been a lot of folks for the past about, 10, 15 years or so who've been very concerned about this development of autonomous weapons. There's been a larger international campaign to stop killer robots, too. There's a lot of folks who came out of the anti-landmine treaty and then refocused on this, seeing this as sort of the next big challenge to address. And they're looking for very comprehensive bans on these autonomous systems. And their concerns are multifold. So first, there's the ethical concern immediately of, is it okay just to allow robots to kill just in general? We see, for example, when landmines were first introduced in the U.S. Civil War, there was a lot of folks who were concerned who said, this is not a gentlemanly way to fight. We fight eye to eye, man to man, that type of thing. And, there's certainly a degree of that with some of these current autonomous weapon systems where, it's actually selectively engaging a tank, a person, that type of thing. So it's very potentially different. What's more is there's also potential concerns about sort of how does this affect escalation dynamics? That is, if we're not because these drones, they don't have moms, they don't have dads, they don't have brothers, sisters, anything like that. It's relatively easy to use them and use them in force. So does that mean that states will be maybe more readily engaging in some of this conflict? But at the same time, because they don't have a mom, they don't have a dad, if they get shot down, it's not necessarily a big deal. So there's a complex relationship there between sort of the escalation dynamics of whether it's going to be more escalatory or maybe it isn't that big of a deal because it's not a big deal if we lose them. Likewise, as the spread, what does that mean for state security? Some states might have a robust air defense system, defenses that can deal with these things. Others won't. Civilians certainly won't. So how does that affect sort of the broader security dynamic, across the globe? So where do we go from here? So I think there's obviously a key consideration to think about these ethics and sort of the second order effects of what this warfare means and how do we balance these competing values. So like on the one hand, yes, autonomy does create significant military advantage in sort of addressing those jamming, providing different types of capability, but also there's some real ethical issues, especially because what happens if these systems make an error? Because some of these current AI systems, they're particularly vulnerable to small changes where a single pixel change can cause the system to confuse a dog with a stealth bomber. So what happens if we have 1,000 of those drones all operating together in autonomous swarm, all making decisions and also all collaborating? How do we accept that trade-off versus the trade-off of the military value that ultimately comes with them? And I think it'll be critical in all of this to sort of monitor the expansion of these trends, both, nationally as well as globally, as well as in specific states, understand how are these technologies used in specific areas or not being used. Because ultimately, these technologies are going to be a function of the larger social environment and the larger military environment that they're in. Some states may choose not to use these technologies for a wide variety of reasons, while others do. And over time, these technologies are going to change and they're going to evolve. And so how does this happen? Because, I hit 4 different trends there. Not all of those are going to happen tomorrow. Some of them might be 10, 20 years from now. Some might be 50, but in each of those are going to affect the larger threat dynamics in different ways. And finally, I think it's important to sort of get ahead of this curve. We need exercise, we need war games, we need modeling and simulation, we need academic analysis to try to understand what are these larger effects and how do they interact not only with drones themselves, but how do they interact with the larger security environment? Because the reality is that drones are just one part of the larger military complex. We have many technologies, and in some cases, drone might be incredibly useful. In others, they might be incredibly totally irrelevant. Because they're going to fit with other types of things. So how do we balance the drones against the larger conflict dynamic? So with that, I'll conclude that the future of drones are here. We've seen these technology being used incredibly and significantly across many different battlefields, not only by states, but by non-state actors, by cartels. And this technology is here and it's spreading fast. All of those 4 trends I mentioned, AI, autonomy, even swarming, those are things you can get commercially now. Not to the level of, military capability, of course, but those are here and they're going to move fast. Thank you.
Wow, I really love that technology side. I have to admit, I was one of the nerds in the lab, and I got an inner feeling that I should be doing something more meaningful. So I decided to work on human security. It was a new concept coming of age. And I remember when I first became a political scientist across the causeway at RMC, I was debating with a Queen's University professor, Kim Nossel, and he had just published a piece in the Globe and Mail, an op-ed titled "Human Security: Foreign Policy for Wimps." And my argument back then was that actually human security actually puts you into lots of positions whereby you have to overcome the wimp instinct and be able to take action when people's lives are at risk. So I did my PhD in chemistry, as mentioned, and I put at the beginning of it this quote from Albert Einstein saying that concern for, I'll use the modern terms, humanity and its fate should be the chief interest of all technical endeavors. Never forget this in the midst of your diagrams and equations. And I forgot most of my diagrams and equations, but the wise words of that scientist sage Albert Einstein kept in my mind, and looking at how you can apply science and technology to international affairs, which is why I'm so happy to be on the panel today. Back when the Freedom from Fear was coming out, Canada decided to not use the UN Development Program definition from 1994, but rather to emphasize the freedom from fear aspect of security rather than the freedom from want, as was originally in a much broader perspective. And I was quite happy with that and the human security agenda. And this is pulled up from that slide presentation of a quarter century ago, where we were looking at the human security agenda. And what I'm going to speak about today is the applications of technology to peace operations, peace support operations. The UN has the peace operations all around the world, and 12 peace operations and about 20 or plus special political missions trying to bring about peace. And it's a really huge challenge, an impossible task, because in many cases, it's entirely in the hands of the parties whether they want to come to peace or not. And the UN can only try and influence it, try and push it in a direction where the parties are concerned about their populations, about the human security of their populations, and less concerned about their own selfish interests, either personally or their group interests or their national interests. The UN's monitoring mandates have evolved over time. Originally, in the traditional missions was just monitoring ceasefires and peace agreements, but then got into protected areas and persons. And that opened up a whole new realm of critique, whereby you could say that the UN is failing when it's not achieving the ideal task. It's not establishing justice and peace, because it's resources, and it's actually not dependent on the UN. The UN was only trying to support any peace process that's there. Hence, NATO ended up adopting the term peace support operation, because peacekeeping operations were often criticized because they couldn't keep the peace, when in fact all they could do was support the peace, and it's really up to others to do the hard work on peace. So the UN was also monitoring elections in that transition period between physical to political scientists. I served with the UN in missions and was there for was an electoral officer in the East Timor referendum, which brought about the birth of a new nation. But I also bear the scars of that mission, because there was a reign of terror of about 10 days. And one of the members of my team was killed, as well as people I knew. And in a location where where I'd done voter education, there was a massacre of over 100 people. But this is all really part of the elections monitoring and the elections supervision that we did. And there was the lack of ability for the UN to know or make some intelligence estimates pushed me in the direction of looking at peacekeeping intelligence. So I was pushing that for a decade. And eventually the UN came up with its peacekeeping intelligence policy and means, but it's been a long, slow fight. The UN, of course, has been doing human rights since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And that's a really important part, including of peace operations, where they have a human rights components in multidimensional missions. They have to do sanctions monitoring. In some cases, a look at the early warning of armed group actions and spoilers of the peace process. They're sometimes tasked with looking at resource exploitation, which is fueling the fires of conflicts. And of course, they have to look at the safety and security of their own personnel. And that's where UAVs or drones comes in particularly useful, when you can send people to an area or decide to use an unmanned or unvehicled, uncrewed system or uninhabited, if you want to, probably the best word, for going into these areas to monitor the different actions of the parties. And it's a dilemma, because you want to have a person there to be able to have influence on the parties, like the dilemma that the UN has experienced in Lebanon today with actual personnel in the field during a war. And the value of technology is huge in that area, where you can do monitoring with less risk to human life. And there is a monitoring gap between the capability, obviously, of the UN and the mandates that are given to it. So the technologist in me said, well, let's look at some of the ways that technology can help. And when I first started, peacekeeping was really the human eyeball, Mark I eyeball, sometimes aided by binoculars. And so I ended up doing work at Sandia National Labs in the United States, looking at how to convert some technologies used for other military activities into peacekeeping. And I looked at the problems of unaided monitoring, that you can't see over large areas with your human eyeball at night, underground, remote in difficult terrain. Or once you see it, then the UN would usually typically file a report, but it would be about recording. They didn't have the capacity to record beyond writing that report, analyzing, sharing, and other ways of transmitting that information. So technology provides a much greater spectrum to look at and help solve some of those problems. With the visible spectrum, as you know, just 400 to 700 nanometers of wavelength, just being a very small part of the broader electromagnetic spectrum. And if you can start to get into the infrared or into the ultraviolet, you can get a whole bunch of new, or the whole spectrum indeed, a whole bunch of new sensing techniques. So you can increase the range and accuracy of your observation. You can do continuous monitoring. You can increase the effectiveness, including cost effectiveness in some cases. I did a study and walked the green line in Nicosia to look at how cameras can be used to replace observation posts. And they were 10 times cheaper in the first year and 100 times cheaper in subsequent years because of the ability to actually get real-time awareness and not have to have the 24-hour turnover of personnel with 8-hour shifts. And indeed, in some cases, the UN would show the sides, the Greek Cypriot or the Turkish side, images to say this is where you have a violation occurring. And that would help to create the parties being more in compliance with their obligations, because the evidence was right there. You can enhance the safety and security, and you can do, of course, the recordings. So one of the results was writing a book about this subject, and the UN decided to do a panel on this, an expert panel, and look at the different uses of technologies. And when I first did this figure, there were only about half the technologies in this figure were actually used. But over time, the UN did pick up more of the technologies, including aerostats, the use of the radars on the ground, UAVs, the first mission assets. UAVs were in 2013 in the Congo, and ground surveillance radars, et cetera. All very important, including ground penetrating radar, which is valuable for detecting mass graves, as well as for detecting weapons systems, because a lot of the parties are supposed to disarm, but they don't, so they hide the weapons in the ground, and it's up to the UN and as part of DDR, disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, to detect those systems. So much interesting scientific challenges in the systems, technical challenges, that there was lots to study here. And this is the example in the green line in Cyprus, where the observation post was replaced over time. And now it's just such a standard technology, but it did actually make a difference in effectiveness on the ground. Canada, when it deployed in Ethiopia and Eritrea to monitor a temporary security zone, used the Coyote reconnaissance vehicles, now being replaced But it was very useful. In fact, I spoke to some of the people who were in those vehicles, saying that the parties would actually come to them and say, we're going to be doing this at night. We're going to be moving some of our rock statues, which they used to be able to pretend that they were humans and confuse the enemy. We're going to be removing those. And they would tell the UN, tell the US, and the Canadian personnel that they were doing this because they knew that otherwise they'd be detected. These vehicles were super good at doing detection of people moving at night, and they had ground surveillance radar as well. So very useful for actually doing violation monitoring. So here's a picture of some of them. In fact, one Canadian said if we used the Canadian coyotes that we had, we could cover the entire temporary security zone between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Another capacity was night vision. And what I documented the use of night vision in Haiti. So the force commander, Carlos dos Santos Cruz from Brazil, he preferred operations at 2 a.m. in the morning because then there were fewer people in the street, so less collateral damage if you were doing an operation against the gangs. And as well, they had superior information awareness because of the night vision goggles that the UN had. So they actually took on the gangs of Cité Soleil, and he walked me through the areas which they had liberated from the gangs by using these night operations and feints and putting snipers up on top of water towers and whatnot, and showing that you can actually take on the gangs in Haiti. Something we should keep in mind now, even as we face that tremendous challenge in Haiti today. The final report of this panel was resulted in a UN doing its 18-month implementation process, whereby we saw a lot more being brought in. And one of the concepts that was coined was the technology contributing country. If some countries can't be troop contributing countries, can't be police contributing countries, could they become tech CCs? And that entered into the lexicon, and I was very pleased when the term was used by the White House to say that the US in 2016, before that election, said that it wanted to become a leading tech CC. So seeing a concept that I'd put into the system actually being applied was somewhat satisfying for an academic. The UN also started the Partnership for Technology and Peacekeeping. Their last conference was in Nepal just a year ago, and they now have a Signals Academy, which effectively is using is the technology academy where they're doing training for, especially they have women's training programs on technologies. This is the first UAS, uninhabited aerial system, that was deployed by the UN in Congo in 2013. That was the first deployment. Before that, there had been UAVs deployed in missions, but they were usually by contingents. And when the contingent would leave, they would bring away their assets. So it was a contingent asset, not a mission asset that could be used by the whole mission. And then I saw when I was visiting MONUSCO in Central African Republic, the use of these Chinese drones, DJI Phantom drones, and each observation post was given 2 of them. So they could actually monitor what was going on in a much larger area. And lots of documentation where it made a difference. One case, the civilian representative in an area said, look, I can see these fires going on, and telling the UN forces, you have to go there. I can see that, what's going on with this, and actually forcing the very reluctant contingent to go into areas where there was active fighting going on. Other times they could see that there were people who were a mob that was assembling, and they could do it from the air and get an idea of where the exits were for the UN staff, or trying to understand where the mobs were coming from. They could also look in advance of checkpoints. One of the big problems with the UN patrols is that they'll come across a checkpoint and they could be stuck there. But if you actually know there's a checkpoint there, you can go around it. So you can use the aerial reconnaissance in advance of your patrols. They also did it for conflict impact assessment, battle damage assessment, where you could see which places were subject to ethnic cleansing, which houses had been burned, and to be able to count them. And when I presented this to the Undersecretary General, I said, I would love to be able to show these kind of images to the UN Security Council for concrete evidence. And at one point, they actually had images from the air showing 1,000 people coming to do cattle stealing in South Sudan. So there was advance warning, even in the Security Council before that event happened, so they could see a long line of men going north in order to do that stealing. So another area, which is because of the ubiquitous nature of cell phones now in Africa, whereas before it was so isolated, you can now go to very remote areas and see the advertising between different cell phone companies, that you can actually use the local population, because they are the human security. That's what you want to ensure. It's their security. And so you can use what I call protection through connection. The cell phones of the local population can be used for people to tell you, hey, I know that an attack is coming. Could you please come and try and prevent that? And I've documented cases where they actually did send out units, Nepalese in the Congo, for instance, where they actually responded within 15 minutes. And the UN, of course, had a filter system. In Haiti, they had an office that would actually look at all the crank calls that were coming in and make sure that they weren't that they weren't responding when there was false alarms. So I call this the coalition of the connected, and part of participatory peacekeeping. And then this would look at the population itself, be human security centered. The population would be the actual main source of information, with technology on top of that, locally hired observers, and then the international observers, which are usually far too few in number to cover the area, would actually be just on the top of that tier, but not the biggest source of information. Now, the UN did at times use force. What I documented mostly was in the Congo and the Mi-24s and the Mi-35s. They're the attack helicopters coming from Ukraine and India, where they did see actual intervening forces about to attack civilians. I'll give you an example from MINUSCA in Central African Republic. When I was visiting there, I spoke with the head of the Senegalese unit, the attack helicopter unit. And they had a case where there was an attacking force coming from Bria to take out a leader in Bambari. And the UN put several red lines. And when that convoy kept on increasing, the attack helicopter came out and shot up a few of the technicals, and the group went back. And then the force commander said, well, we have to deal with the problem that there's a militia leader in Bambari. So he took the attack helicopter, put it over his house, and saying, you have to leave because you are putting the people in Bambari in danger. So actually forcing the other side to leave and showing some level of impartiality. So just a couple of images from that operation. Now, non-lethal weapons were mentioned. This is a really key technology. I've always been pushing the UN to explore more of that, because the capacity to just use lethal force can have such negative repercussions for human security. So exploring non-lethal weapons is great, whether it be sticky foam or just the use of the regular pepper spray, that sort of thing. There's so much to explore there, not enough time to actually start covering that. But I do go out and look at markets in Africa, and I actually saw tasers and conducted energy devices, which are used to be sold on the marketplace there. So there's already lots to explore. I'll point out one technology which I'm particularly keen on and been promoting, is to use lasers. So if someone is committing a violation, you could shine a laser beam on their chest and say, we're watching you from the sky, so from perhaps a UAV. And that way you can actually warn people that they're being monitored, and indeed capture, that evidence can be used for future criminal proceedings. And also cyber peacekeeping, an idea I've been promoting, where the UN can do the same thing in cyberspace that it does in physical space. It can do monitoring, it can do buffer zones, layers in cyberspace. It can help nations rebuild afterwards. There's lots of scope as we get into this hybrid warfare and cyber warfare domain. And the last technology I'll mention is the peacekeeping simulation, which is using the video technologies, which are so popular with the younger generation, and using them for teaching. So I've developed 3 or 4 peacekeeping simulations, or games, if you like to call it that, whereby my students at the Joint Command and Staff Program will be playing in 2 weeks the simulation where they're investigating atrocity using VR. So they have VR headsets that they can explore how they respond and what the ways the UN would use or could use, and the challenges with that. There's many more. We're trying to make this multiplayer, looking at the possibility of using it in the metaverse. And we now have a web version, so you don't even need to download it. It can be playable on the web address there in case you're interested. So much limitations from contingent owned or UN owned or contractor supplied technologies. I don't have time to go through them, but you can imagine that each of these has pros and cons. So the UN has to balance those different types of means. And I'll come to my concluding thoughts that there's no technological fix. I mean, technologists and former scientists like myself have to realize that we can make these proposals that can help. They're just assisting. But in the end, it's human beings who are talking to each other, who are interacting and getting the parties together. That's the most important part, so that they can actually resolve their disputes peacefully rather than at the end of a gun. But the experience of the last 10 years has shown that the UN is capable of incorporating advanced technologies, just isn't doing so on a consistent basis, largely because it's underfunded and under-resourced, especially the OICT, which is the main office of information and communication technology that has taken on what they now call their field technology service units in the field, which formerly were just IT units. Now they have a much broader mandate. So all of this is a continuing adventure. I went from 10 years working on arms control to peace operations, just because there's just so much dynamism, so much need, and so much the way that the parties are acting and the number of disputes in the world, especially with all the disputes in all the areas needing peacekeeping today, that it's just a fascinating area to study, but also it's an area where you can actually get quite depressed because of the lack of action compared to the huge need out there. But all the more important that we do things like this, to be concerned about human security, about the people in the field. And as General Dos Santos Cruz told me, it's the people. That's why we're there. We're there for the people in the field. Let's not forget this when we're deployed, that that's our raison d'etre, is to actually support the populations and their human security. Thank you.